So in our notes here, there's so in your packet, things are going to be switched around a little bit, in that we've sort of reorganized things in a way I think that makes better sense than maybe what you have in your packet. So you may have to flip around to find the slide that you need to write some things down, or some of the slides I'm going to show you you may not actually have in your packet. So just going to have to be a little bit flexible here. These in your way? All right, so let's start by talking about seeds. So find this where we in your notes where we start talking about seeds. There you go.
Just secret miters.
Where do you need this?
To give such big flowers.
So, no, go back. So, seeds. We did a slide?
Yeah.
All right, but there's a bunch of things. There's a bunch of things that I'm also going to review with you again. So, first of all, a seed is basically contains the embryo of a new plant, along with some stored up energy that plant is going to use when it begins to grow. Okay? So that's what a seed is. It's basically a reproductive structure that a plant uses to grow a new plant. And so seeds have a coat around them, the seed coat, little sort of thin shell. And then most of a seed is actually made up of what's called the cotyledon. This area here. It's usually light white in color, sort of tan, and that's basically starch. That contains stored up energy that the plant is going to use when it begins growing. Also inside of that seed, you have a tiny little plant embryo. It's got tiny little leaves that are formed and the beginnings of a root. Okay? That's basically the embryo of that plant. Okay? And often these seeds form, they only form after the ovule has been pollinated. So after the pollen connects with an ovule, then the seed can form. And you have those various parts inside. And then when that seed begins to grow, we call that germination. When we say a seed germinates, what we mean is that it starts to grow. You gotta flip ahead. Yeah, it's where it says germination. Yeah, I have two slides that. So write down, it says germination at the top.
Oh, I see it.
So germination is when the seed begins to grow, and a seed does not really start to germinate unless certain conditions have been met. If you ever planted a garden, you could go to the store, you could buy a packet of seeds. Do those seeds grow in those packets?
No.
No. What don't they have? Why don't they start growing when they're there sitting on the shelf?
They don't have soil.
Any?
They don't have water.
They don't have moisture. What else? They don't have any soil.
They don't have any
What's that?
sunlight.
They don't have any sunlight. And so some different plants need different conditions met in order to start germinating. But some of them, water. So when that seed starts to get wet, okay?
We don't have that.
Yeah, you don't have this. It's okay. When that seed gets wet, that sort of begins the process. So those envelopes of seeds you see at the store, they're kept dry. And not until those seeds start to get wet does the germination process start to begin. And getting wet helps soften the seed coat. It helps enzymes start to be activated, which are going to break down the starch that's stored there in the cotyledon. They also need oxygen, okay? Because, again, they have starch stored in that seed, but to use the energy, it needs to go through the process of respiration, so you need oxygen. Also, the right temperature is important. Seeds need to be at the proper temperature before they will actually begin to germinate, because enzymes only work at certain temperatures. So they need all of those things. And so what happens, you do have this slide, it's filled in already for you. What happens is when a seed is actually planted, or when a seed falls into the soil, it gets wet, obviously. Okay, it gets wet. The inside of the seed starts to swell a little bit. The seed coat breaks open. And that's the first stages. The seed coat breaks open. Then oxygen is able to enter into the seed, and the seed is able to start breaking down that starch that's stored up in the cotyledon and using that stored up energy to begin growing. Okay? The root starts growing longer and starts growing downward. Okay? The stem starts to grow, and it grows up and out of the soil, eventually breaking through the soil. And then the first leaves emerge. And once leaves emerge, then what can begin happening?
The seed falls off.
Well, that does happen. The seed coat falls off. But what are those leaves? What's their job? Rosie? Photosynthesis. Because once those leaves emerge, then they can capture sunlight. Then photosynthesis can happen. And then the plant's creating its own food. But up until those leaves emerge, it's relying on the food that's stored in the cotyledon from that seed. Here's what it actually looks like. These are actual pictures. You see the seed starting to grow. And then you see the stem extending. And those seeds eventually grow. It's just, those are called root hairs. And you'll see in this picture, those root hairs help absorb as much water as possible. Okay? Because it gives them a greater surface area. Again, you see the same sort of thing here. The seed coat splits. The radicle or the root emerges. It grows downward. Root hairs develop. So it can take in water. The stem grows upwards. And the cotyledons eventually turn into the leaves.
Hey, looks like nice.
The seed coat falls off, and then you're left with the little tiny plant, a seedling we would call it, and then it's going to start to grow. And this is what it actually looks like. This is a plant first emerging from the soil. You can see the cotyledons here. You can see the root that grew. You can see the seed coat that's sort of left over. It eventually falls off. And again, the first leaves emerge, and then it's sort of on its own. And now we're going back in your notes a little bit. Did we cover these slides already?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we did. So once the seeds have formed in a plant after pollination, they need to be dispersed. In order for these seeds to start to grow, they need to be dispersed. And plants have various adaptations to help disperse those seeds. Okay? Some are spread by the wind. These, especially things like dandelions, if you imagine, each tiny, when the dandelion forms a little puffball thing, you blow on it and it all spreads out. Each of those tiny little things that floats off has a little seed attached. And so they spread out, the wind could carry them for a very far distance until they land somewhere and start to grow. These maple seeds, same thing. They have those little helicopter sort of attachments so that as they fall out of the maple tree, the wind can carry that spinning helicopter and disperse it, spread it out so it's not falling directly under the tree it came from. Some seeds, like coconuts, float in the water. You can float from one area to another, and once they wash up on a beach, on shore, then they can start to grow there.
Like, can a coconut, like, grow in the water? Like, you know.
No,
like
they need to be on land,
And what's after water? When the water.
like a coconut. So animals often are responsible for dispersing seeds as well, because after seeds form, often a fruit forms around it, and often those seeds are attractive to various types of animals. Okay, and so animals will eat the fruit. At the same time, they ingest the seeds from that plant. And then as they go to the bathroom eventually, those seeds come out of the animal's digestive system. But it's in a different place now, and so those seeds have been dispersed. Some have burrs, which stick to the fur of an animal. And inside of these burrs are the seeds. And so they kind of hitch a ride on an animal's fur. Eventually they fall off somewhere, and the seeds have been dispersed. Okay? Nuts, for example, often, there's an extra R there, often animals bury their seeds, like squirrels do, to go back and eat them later on throughout the winter, but sometimes they forget about them, and those nuts develop into actual plants, and they start to grow.
How come, like, the burdock thing, how come if they won't, like, how come they're so sticky?
There's what?
Like, how come they're so sticky?
Just have little hooks on them that kind of hook on, kind of like Velcro, and they hook on the fur.
Oh, then why is it so hard to get off of your
Just
hair?
because all those hooks are holding on, you have to sort of pull them off.
Okay, never mind.
Another interesting thing are seeds that burst. Forget-me-nots you could find around here, or snapdragons sometimes they're called. The seeds form inside these little pods, and then if you touch them, has anyone ever seen these? They explode, right? They kind of pop, and they send their seeds flying out. Here's a little video you can see. They're called touch-me-nots, or there's lots of different names. You can see. They just sort of pop, and they send those seeds flying all over the place.
But they pop on their own.
Yeah, like something, an animal or something brushes up against them, or if the wind blows into it, they could pop it once they're mature. So you can go on it, once you find a bush of these things, you can press them on, they all explode. They're kind of cool. Fruit that animals eat is often brightly colored, attractive to animals. It's filled with nutrients and sugars, they taste good. And this is all to encourage animals to eat those fruits. And as those seeds pass through the digestive system, they get eliminated in a new area.
Whoa.
And then they come out in the waste of that animal. This is from a bear. So
That's huge.
bears will, when berries, for example, so fruits are usually only available in a fairly limited time. For example, berries, if you have like raspberry bushes in your yard or something, you know, they mature and then they're gone pretty quickly. And so in those times, animals will eat a lot of these fruits. As the seeds are not actually broken down and digested, they go through the digestive tract and you end up with those seeds being deposited when the animal goes to the bathroom. This is from a fox. This is from a raccoon. But all of these examples, birds eliminate seeds as well. And some seeds actually only will germinate once the seeds have been through the entire digestive system. So if we look at sort of the overall view of sexual reproduction in plants, we start with the flowers, often visited by pollinators. As they feed in the flower, they get pollen grains stuck to them. As they go fly away to visit another flower, okay? As they come into that flower, some of those pollen grains fall off, and some of them land on, what part is this? The stigma. This is the female parts of this flower. And so some of those pollen grains are transferred onto the stigma of another flower. Once they're there, they can start to grow. And the pollen grows a tube, and it goes down the style of the pistil into the ovary. And that pollen grain there can fertilize one of these female cells called an ovule. And once it's fertilized, it can grow into a zygote and eventually a seed. Usually after that, after pollination, the petals start to fall off. They sort of die off. They fall off. And then the ovary of that plant, of that flower, can start to develop into an actual fruit. And so if you ever had a garden, you may have noticed tomatoes or peas or anything really, fruit that you grow, it starts off as a flower. You see, if you have tomato plants in your yard, they start off these little yellow flowers. Once they're pollinated, then the tomato starts to grow afterwards. Same thing with peas or any of these things. And so it develops a fruit. Yeah, those are fruits. Peas and tomatoes, anything with seeds in it is technically a fruit according to biology. And that fruit either falls to the ground or an animal eats it somehow.
I have a question.
Hold on, let's finish my little animation here. Eventually an animal eats that fruit, ingests all of it, then it goes somewhere else, far away, and eventually those seeds are eliminated from that animal, and they have then successfully been dispersed to a new area where they can grow into a new plant.
Oh, that's nice.
Sam?
Wait, now I forget now.
Question.
So all of that stuff,
Oh yeah, is apricot count as a fruit?
yeah, it's a fruit. There's a pit in the middle that has a seed in it.
Like,
So all those things we've talked about so far are about sexual reproduction in plants, combining of the pollen grain and the ovule. But plants also can reproduce asexually, okay, in several different ways. We'll talk about some of those ways, but we know, we've talked about this several times. Asexual reproduction is without combining of genes from two parents. It's when an offspring basically makes a copy of it, when a parent makes a copy of itself to produce an offspring. And this happens naturally in plants sometimes. Two ways are rhizomes and runners. Rhizomes are when a plant will grow sort of a stem just underneath the soil, horizontally, and then from that stem, a new plant will start to grow. New leaves will start to grow, and it reproduces. This is how grass, one way that grass can reproduce. If you plant some grass and you have one grass plant, it will spread to take over an area of soil by sending out these rhizomes under the soil, and then new grass plants pop up from those rhizomes.
Is that how vine reproduce?
No, vines are a little different. We'll talk about those today. So this is some grass that's been taken out of the soil, and so this part is the rhizome, this little part that was under the soil and popping out from our various grass plants. But really, they're all identical to the original. Those are produced asexually. A runner is very similar, but the runner travels above ground. It's a stem that grows above ground, and when it touches the soil, it starts to grow roots and starts to grow into a new plant. Strawberries grow by these runners. That the strawberry plant, if you ever grew them, it sends out these little stems into the soil, and when they touch the ground, the soil, they grow roots, and a new strawberry plant emerges. But they're identical. They're just copies. There's no pollination that needs to happen in order for a plant to reproduce through rhizomes or runners. Also, tubers, yeah, you have tubers on yours. We took them off the notes. But a tuber, what's an example of a tuber? It's a tuber you eat very often.
Twix.
Potato. And a potato is a tuber. A potato grows underground. If you've ever cooked with potatoes, you know they have those things are called eyes. These little parts on the potato, those could each grow into a new tomato. If you take a potato, chop it up, and plant it in the ground, any part that has one of those little eyes of the potato on it, that will sprout into a new potato plant, but it's produced asexually. But also humans use asexual reproduction to produce new plants. And we do this often if you have a plant that is produced really good tomatoes, or produces peas that are resistant to dry conditions. Humans often will try to reproduce that plant asexually so that the new plants also have those characteristics. They can do this in a couple ways. One is through something called fragmentation. If you have sort of this plant in your yard and you think it's really, really nice, grows beautiful flowers, you can actually cut off a leaf from it and then plant that in some soil or some water, and often it will start to grow roots and then grow into a whole new plant. But again, it's just a copy. It only had that one original plant that you took it from. So it's a form of asexual reproduction. Another thing that's often done in agriculture, especially in the production of fruits, is something called grafting. In grafting, someone cuts the upper portion off of one plant, okay, it's called the scion, and they attach it to the stem of another plant called the stock. You can actually even do this with two different types of plants. You could take an apple, the top of an apple tree that's going to produce the apples, and graft it onto the trunk of a different tree that's sort of stronger or more disease resistant, and it will sort of grow back together, and it'll form one plant that's actually a mixture of two separate plants. And I'll show you some pictures here. So we're joining plants together. This is one in which a person grafted 3 plants together, a plum and a peach tree, the tops of plum and peach trees to stock from another tree down here. So this plant, it all sort of heals up, and the vascular tissue connects, and then you have peaches and plums growing on the same tree here. Again, here we have 2 different types of apples. these two stems have been grafted onto one root stock, and each one is producing a different variety of apples. Sometimes you see, like if you have landscaping around your house, sometimes they have like this tree, it's like a long stem, and then it's like an umbrella on the top that goes like this. Often those are produced by grafting a plant with sort of droopy stems on to a stock from just a sturdy straight plant. So if you look closely, you could see the graft area. If you look at a plant that's been grafted, this area when it heals is sort of enlarged, and you can see where the two plants were combined. And so this asexual reproduction is helpful in some ways because it produces identical plants. So sometimes that's good. If you have an apple that you really love the type of apples it produces, well, you probably want a copy of it to grow. You want it to reproduce asexually to give you those same apples. Reproduction can happen faster. For example, grass growing in an empty field, well, for it to go through a process of pollination, producing a seed, spreading the seed, seeds growing, takes a while. But if that plant spreads out using rhizomes, it can happen much more quickly. But the disadvantages of asexual reproduction is kind of the same. The offspring are identical, so there's no new varieties, no new variations. And as we know when we talked about evolution, natural selection, the more variation you have, the more likely it is for that species to be able to survive a disease or a predator or a change in its environment. So when you don't have those variations, then the species may not be able to adapt.
Wait, go back.
And then just the last couple things here to talk about. We saw before vacation some of those videos about those carnivorous plants that trap insects. Those plants are pretty interesting, and they trap those insects because they need certain nutrients that they're not getting out of the soil. Nutrients like, yeah, it's okay, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, these are nutrients that plants need. But sometimes the plants that grow in very poor nutrient soils, they can't get those nutrients from the soil. Instead, they get it from trapping those insects. So often these grow in nutrient-poor soils. They still go through photosynthesis. They're not actually using the insects for energy. They're just using them to get nitrogen or potassium or phosphorus. They're still autotrophs. They're still green. They still go through photosynthesis. They're just getting nutrients from those insects. Some traps snap closed, like the Venus flytrap. Others, like the sundew, are sticky with that nectar. Others have like a little area that insects crawl into but then cannot escape from, like this pitcher plant. All right, and then our very last thing, we don't often think about, but plants can respond to stimuli, just like we can. Now they often do it a little bit more slowly, and they do it by their growth oftentimes, but they can respond to a stimulus. And I have listed here 4 examples of tropisms. Phototropism. Phototropism is when a plant grows a certain way, responding to what? What do you think it means? Phototropism. Photo. Like a photograph? What's the photo part come from? Photosynthesis? Means it has to do with? No. Light. Phototropism is when plants grow in relation to light. Like if you ever have plants growing on a windowsill, they don't grow straight up. What do? Yeah, they grow and they start bending towards the light. They're responding in their growth to some stimulus, that there's light on one side. Hydrotropism. Cindy? Water. Roots of plants will grow toward a source of water. If there's more water in one area of the soil, the roots will grow towards it. Gravidotropism?
Gravity.
Yeah, as a response to gravity. As seeds start to germinate, the roots grow down, responding to gravity, the stem grows up. Even if you plant a seed upside down, as those parts emerge, they will grow the right direction because they can respond to gravity. Pigmo is responding to touch. And some plants, like a Venus flytrap, responds to touch. A sensitive plant responds to touch. Other plants will respond when they touch a surface, they'll start to form a pad that sort of sticks on. That's how, like, if you have vines going up your house or something, often they do that using thigmotropism. So again, plant growing towards light, going up. And this is last video here is kind of neat. You know, things like peas or beans. These are bean plants. When you plant beans in your garden, you would need to provide some sort of structure for them to grow up because they're a vine. And the way they do that is they grow, and they grow in this sort of clockwise or counterclockwise manner. And eventually, once they reach a vertical surface, they start to grow around it. This video shows that. It's a time-lapse video. It's obviously not as fast as it appears, but you can actually see the growth. You see it growing in this pattern. And eventually, as you can probably guess, it's going to make contact with one of those surfaces. And it's going to start to wind around it.
Sure, that's why it's spinning.
That's because that's how, until it contacts a vertical surface, that's how it can climb up something. Because it grows around, it grows in that pattern. And you can see another one latches on there, and then they start growing up that vertical surface.
Okay.
Cut.
We have 1 minute.
All right, I do have something for you to work on until the end.